I don't think we should blush to acknowledge the important ingredient of molasses in our War of Independence.
Food, like life, can be complicated. That's why I'm on a quest to learn all about our food and the crimes, issues, and debates that are tied to it. I hope you'll join me on my quest to explore the dark side of dining. The year was 1772, and tensions in the American colonies had been escalating for years. Recently, England had decided to place the Royal Navy in charge of law enforcement, especially pertaining to the smuggling of one product: molasses. The town of Newport was a central port involved in the smuggling trade, and when the British Navy boat the HMS Gaspee ran aground while chasing a smuggling vessel on June 9th, the people of Newport decided it was time to act. A mob led by one John Brown rowed out to the stranded ship and burned it down. This, along with several other incidents, fanned the flames of rebellion that eventually led to the American Revolutionary War. But why did people care so much about their ability to smuggle molasses? That's why I brought author of Smuggler Nation, Peter Andreas, onto the show. But I'll let him introduce himself.
Yeah, I'm a professor of political science and international studies here at Brown University. I've done a lot of work related to transnational crime, smuggling, global policing, border politics, border enforcement, contemporary, but also a lot of historical work.
Professor Andreas knows his stuff. His book, Smuggler Nation: How Illicit Trade Made America, is all about how the smuggling of various goods led to the United States of America as we know it today. I asked him for some of the context around why molasses smuggling, in particular, contributed so much to the American Revolution. Here's what he had to say. So, I brought you on today to talk about the American molasses smuggling trade back in the day, which not a lot of people are really aware of. So, could you kind of give us some context on the background of this, kind of what economic, political, or environmental factors kind of led to this trade?
Yeah, it's hugely important. I mean, it's a founding story of America that most people haven't paid much attention to. People think about the founding and they think of, you know, taxes and justice and freedom and so on. But the most important export of the New England colonies was rum, and the most important ingredient that goes into producing rum is molasses. And the colonists could not possibly obtain enough molasses from the British West Indies, which they were supposed to buy it all from. And so they resorted to smuggling channels to bring in illicit supplies of molasses from the French West Indies and elsewhere. And so um, it's an economic story, but it also becomes a political story because British efforts to crack down on this smuggling business prompted a backlash that was a key part of the buildup to the American Revolution. In fact, John Adams himself, after the Revolution, wrote to a colleague. This is paraphrasing John Adams. I don't think we should blush to acknowledge the important ingredient of molasses in our War of Independence.
Molasses makes rum, and rum makes for a strong economy. The question I had on my mind was, how did they even manage to smuggle the molasses into the colonies?
Right. Well, all sorts of ways. Of course, it was all by sea. For many years, in fact, decades, the British imperial authorities kind of just overlooked it. It was not a priority to enforce the formal trade rules, which were incredibly restrictive and prohibitive. And so, it was pretty flagrant and widespread and entrenched, and it was totally taken for granted and accepted as everyday practice. Customs agents were deeply corrupt in the sense that they would get paid off routinely. It was all sort of normal business. Smuggling was not a sideshow or some shady thing. It was considered acceptable business for the leading merchants in New England society, and the British didn't pay much attention to it until after the 7 Years' War with France, when Britain found itself broke and needing to make up the loss. And so they came up with the seemingly rational idea of actually starting to enforce the trade rules, and that backfired badly.
And backfire badly it did. This is where the incident I mentioned at the beginning of the episode comes into play. The American colonists did not like what was happening, and decided to take action. Here's how Peter explains it.
Well, I mean, keep in mind, the distilleries for rum were concentrated in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, and in Rhode Island, especially in Newport. So in some ways, Newport was ground zero in this. And one thing, not an episode, but an escalation that happened, which has interesting parallels to today's war on drugs, is part of the way the British got serious about cracking down was they realized they couldn't trust customs agents because they were too corrupt and entrenched in local communities. And so they came up with the idea of, we'll turn our the British Royal Navy, will turn them into customs enforcers. So we will, take British naval ships and they will do the patrolling. They will do the enforcing. They will do the confiscation and so on. And sure enough, you turn a military on merchants and the general public, and that's not going to go too well. So they enforced sometimes punitively, and it led to mob riots. It led to tar and feathering of government agents. It led to stealing back confiscated goods. It led to furious letter writing to the authorities in London saying this is an outrage. The most famous incident, which probably had something to do with molasses smuggling, but it was smuggling in general, was something called the Gaspee Affair. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but basically, it's Rhode Island's claim to fame. It's their first shot in the American Revolution. It happened before the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party gets a lot more attention, but no, a British ship, a naval vessel, was chasing a smuggling vessel in Narragansett Bay, which is quite close to where I'm talking from right now. And the British vessel ran aground, and so the local merchants and political leaders, including John Brown, who was a founder of my university, organized a raiding party, which at night basically attacked, boarded, and burned to the water's edge the Gaspee. As a sort of retaliation for the British effort to crack down on their smuggling trade. And John Brown became a wanted man after this. But now it's celebrated every summer. They have Gaspee Days, and they celebrate it as this heroic moment in Rhode Island's history. But it's really a defiant smuggling story. The colonies are fragmented in some ways, but when you attack part of their core livelihood, it certainly brings them together in some ways, especially if there's a larger sense of unfairness or injustice involved, because this was tolerated illicit trade for decades, and then suddenly it's not tolerated. Not only not tolerated, but aggressively, violently cracked down on. And so you can imagine that's going to be a source of great conflict and a unifying source of conflict. So smuggling typically isn't thought of as all that political, but in that particular case, in that particular time, economic opportunity also was part of political defiance.
So the British crackdown on smuggling was in many ways a unifying element for the colonies. I found it interesting how Peter talked about the fact that this smuggling was a core part of their livelihoods. So I asked him about just how extensive this molasses smuggling was, and how it impacted the economy.
It's very hard to actually measure how important something is in illicit trade, illicit markets, illicit smuggling, right? But it's interesting. In this case, we actually do have a pretty good sense of that because rum is a legal product, right? And we know the distilleries are perfectly legal and out in the open. And so we know how much rum they're producing every year. And we know how much molasses is needed to produce that much rum. And we know how much legal molasses they're importing from the British West Indies. And the amount they're importing from the British West Indies can't remotely come close to producing that much rum. And so here's a case where that whole industry doesn't survive without smuggling. And that industry happens to be the most important industry in the New England colonies. And it's important domestically, but it's also important for export, including this is where the dark side of this trade really is highlighted. It's part of the triangle trade. So you bring rum to the coast of Africa, exchange rum for slaves. You bring slaves back to the Caribbean to work on the sugar plantations, which produce the rum, right? And then you bring more molasses back to Rhode Island and Massachusetts. So that's part of the triangle trade. So the whole slave economy is deeply implicated in this molasses trade slash rum export business. What we do know is it's the single most important uh, export product, right? And we also know that the colonies actually, agriculture is terrible. Not much you can grow in the New England colonies compared to, say, the southern colonies, where they have tobacco and so on. So there's not a whole lot that you can offer the rest of the world that's profitable and highly portable and so on, like can compete with rum. There are some things. They smuggled ships. Their shipbuilding industry got a boost by smuggling ships to the very islands which are producing the molasses. They also sold livestock. They also sold various foodstuffs that were then used for slaves, to feed slaves. But rum kind of is the lead export, if you will. And it's not like these colonies had an extraordinarily diversified economic base.
So, the smuggling of molasses for rum fueled all kinds of trade, including, unfortunately, slavery. It was at the heart of people's livelihoods and led in part to the birth of the United States. I asked Peter for a bit of a timeline for these events, and I was kind of surprised at what he told me, especially about what happened after the smuggling crackdown.
You could say in the 18th century, the first 6 decades of that century were the heyday of molasses and tea smuggling. This was a golden age of smuggling. Frankly, it far more important than smuggling today in many ways, across our borders, in terms of its importance for the economy and how accepted it was and how widespread it was and so on, and who was involved and how entrenched the corruption was, taking bribes as standard practice and so on. So those first 6 decades, and then the British tightening its grip and cracking down in the 1760s and all the way leading up to the outbreak of the American Revolution. So really, it goes right up to the American Revolution, where even in the revolution itself, it's interesting. It's hard to imagine today giving soldiers alcohol rations, but George Washington's troops had rum rations. And so did the British. The Redcoats had rum rations. In fact, it was just standard practice that, of course, you give your soldiers rum rations if you can get a hold of it. So hugely important for troop morale. And, that, of course, is a molasses story as well.
Interesting. Yeah, so you could almost say that it helped spark the revolution and then also helped fuel it a little bit.
Yeah, certainly helped everyday daily life of the troops. War is a pretty miserable daily job, frankly, and this softened it up a bit.
As I finished my conversation with Professor Andreas, I asked him about how we could apply this to today, thinking he might have some ideas on how we can counteract smuggling as consumers. To my surprise, he took it in a completely different direction, rather focusing on a different modern parallel.
I mean, what's the clear parallel is, the British militarizing molasses suppression, which ultimately is a war on the rum industry. And rum is alcohol, and alcohol is a drug. That was America's first drug war. Not America's, but it was the first, war on drugs, if you will, and first militarized war on drugs. So you fast forward to today, and you basically front and center in our border politics is the war on drugs, has been for decades now. It comes and goes in terms of its intensity, but it's hugely consequential, and it's multi-billion-dollar industry, and large numbers of Americans are consumers of all sorts of imported illicit psychoactive substances. So, one interesting parallel is that militarization of the effort not only doesn't work terribly well, but it's very risky. There's unintended consequences. So soldiers are not necessarily the best cops, if you will, and use of soldiers to do police work also, there can be a backlash against that because it's thought of as an authoritarian move. Soldiers are trained to kill, right? Police are trained to, at least they're supposed to be, to follow the law, right, and deal with civilians. But there are now thousands of U.S. troops deployed to the southern border, not in a arrest capacity, because right now, anyway, they're not legally allowed to. But there's a huge show of military force at the border, all in the name of stopping the smuggling of drugs and the smuggling of people.
This was by far one of the most interesting episodes I've done. I never would have suspected that much of the American Revolution was, in fact, fueled by the smuggling of molasses. There are always many lessons to learn from history, and sometimes they are rather unexpected. Peter's insights can help us see how food is and has always been a core part of our lives and livelihoods. The question is, are you willing to die for your food? The Dark Side of Dining is a production of Food for Thought Audio. This episode was written, produced, and edited by me, Kenny Mears. I would like to thank today's guest, Professor Peter Andreas. He is a professor at Brown University and the author of Smuggler Nation. His new book, The Illicit Global Economy, was released in June this year. Be sure to check out both books. Links will be in the show notes. As always, thanks for your comments. We read them all, and thanks for listening.